I'm writing a game engine from scratch. The last 2 weeks I spent working on object shadows. I already have shadows on the terrain. I'll quickly explain how they work to show why I need a new system for the objects. The first step is to generate a height map based on the elevation of the islands. This is the high-resolution height map used by the terrain rendering. Because the shadows can come from off-screen, the height map I use for the shadows is bigger in the direction of the sun, and lower resolution. Then, for every pixel in the shadow texture, I iterate in the direction of the sun and compare the angle to the highest point of the terrain to the angle of the sun, a simple form of ray tracing. The next step is to apply a Gaussian blur to the shadow texture. It loses a bit of detail, but it looks a lot nicer, giving this as the final result. Obviously, the game objects don't have height map information, and they move around and rotate, so I've created a second shadow texture. The shadow texture is a render target in visible area space. In the vertex shader, I transform the game objects normally, and translate them to visible area space. When the terrain and ocean are rendered later, I can sample the shadow texture by transforming the terrain position into that same visible area space. Now that I have the objects rendering, the next step is to increase the resolution of the shadow texture, then apply a 5x5 kernel Gaussian blur, so we don't see any flickering when the objects are moving. And finally, bias the blur a little bit to the center pixel to stop thinner shadows from washing out. I didn't get the blur shader working on the first try. This was one of the more interesting bugs I ran into. And finally, I needed to adjust the shadows at sunset and sunrise. There are 3 things I did to do that. First was to reduce the intensity of the shadows a bit, stretch the shadows out away from the distance of the sun, and finally add a bit more blur, giving this as the final result.